The Roman legions were leaving, their polished armor glinting one last time in the British sun as they marched toward the ships that would carry them away forever. And the people watching them go had no idea they were witnessing the end of civilization itself. It was 410 AD, and Emperor Honorius had just sent his devastating message to the Romano-British elite. Look to your own defenses. 3 words that meant Rome was abandoning Britain after nearly 4 centuries of rule, leaving behind a population that had forgotten how to govern themselves, how to defend their borders, how to survive without the empire's iron framework. What followed wasn't the romantic age of Arthur that poets would later sing about, but something far darker, far more violent, and far more fascinating. A 300-year period of chaos, warfare, forgotten kingdoms, and desperate survival that would forge the very DNA of the British Isles. This is the story of Britain's lost kingdoms, the dark ages that history tried to forget, and the men and women who clawed their way through the darkness to build something new from the ashes of Rome. Imagine standing in Londinium in the year 420 AD, just a decade after the legions departed. The once great city that had boasted forums, bathhouses, amphitheaters, and stone buildings that seemed to touch the sky was already falling apart, its population having plummeted from perhaps 60,000 to maybe 5,000 frightened souls huddling in the ruins. The sophisticated Romano-British urban civilization was collapsing with shocking speed because it had been entirely dependent on Roman military protection, Roman trade networks, Roman coinage, and Roman administration. Without these pillars, the whole structure simply imploded. The villa estates in the countryside, those elegant symbols of Roman culture with their mosaic floors and heated baths, were being abandoned as their owners fled to fortified hill forts that hadn't been used since before the Romans came. A regression to Iron Age defensiveness that tells you everything about how terrified people were. Britain was fracturing into dozens of petty kingdoms, each controlled by local strongmen who claimed descent from Roman officials or Celtic tribal leaders, each fighting desperately to control what resources remained, and each knowing that worse threats were gathering beyond the borders. The Picts were sweeping down from the north, fierce painted warriors from what would become Scotland who saw the undefended Roman wall as an open invitation to raid and plunder. The Scots were crossing from Ireland, confusingly named because Scot was the Roman term for Irish raiders, bringing their own culture and language to Britain's western shores. And most ominously, Germanic tribes, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, were beginning to arrive from across the North Sea, initially as hired mercenaries but soon as conquerors who would remake Britain entirely. This is where our story truly begins. In this moment of absolute crisis when Britain's Romano-Celtic population faced an existential threat and made a decision that would haunt them for generations. They invited the wolves to guard the sheep. The most powerful British king in the mid-5th century was a man named Vortigern, whose very name means overlord or high king, suggesting he dominated several of the British kingdoms that had emerged from Rome's collapse. Vortigern faced an impossible situation. His lands were being ravaged by Pictish and Scottish raiders, his people were starving as trade collapsed, and he had no professional army to defend his realm because the only people who knew how to fight in organized units had sailed away with the legions. According to the monk Gildas, writing about a century later in his furious tract on the ruin of Britain, Vortigern and his council made what seemed like a clever decision. They would hire Saxon warriors as federates, giving them land on the eastern coast in exchange for military service against the northern raiders, exactly the kind of arrangement Rome itself had often made with barbarian tribes. The first Saxon leaders to arrive, according to legend, were 2 brothers named Hengist and Horsa, though whether these men actually existed or are mythological figures is hotly debated by historians, who landed on the Isle of Thanet in Kent around 449 AD with just 3 ships full of warriors. Initially, the arrangement worked. The Saxons defeated the Picts and Scots, demonstrating the kind of brutal military efficiency that the civilized Romano-British had lost, and Vortigern rewarded them with more land, more payments, more privileges. But Hengist was no fool. He could see that Britain was weak, divided, rich in resources, and defended by men who had forgotten how to fight. He sent word back to the Germanic homelands that Britain was ripe for the taking, and the trickle of Saxon ships became a flood. The sources tell us that Hengist tricked Vortigern at a peace conference, an event later called the Night of the Long Knives, where Saxon warriors concealed weapons and massacred hundreds of British nobles, though historians question whether this specific event occurred or represents a collapsed memory of many betrayals. What's certain is that by the 450s and 460s, the Saxons had turned from hired defenders into invading conquerors, and Vortigern's desperate gambit had unleashed a catastrophe that would destroy Romano-British civilization forever. The archaeological evidence supports a picture of rapid, violent change. British settlements were burned, villa estates were abandoned never to be reoccupied, pottery production ceased, literacy disappeared, and the urban culture that Rome had built over 4 centuries vanished so completely that within 2 generations, people were living in wooden huts among the ruins of stone cities they no longer understood how to maintain. This wasn't a peaceful cultural transition or a gradual merger of peoples. This was conquest, ethnic cleansing, and cultural annihilation on a scale that left the British language itself pushed to the western fringes of the island that had once been entirely British-speaking. But the Romano-British didn't disappear without a fight. And this is where history blurs into legend, where the documented record fades and the mists of myth roll in to obscure one of the most disputed periods in British history. Somewhere around 500 AD, the Saxon advance was halted, thrown back, defeated in a series of battles that bought the British kingdoms another generation of independence before the final conquest. The later Welsh monk Nennius, writing in the 9th century, attributed these victories to a war leader named Arthur, who won 12 battles against the Saxons, culminating in the great victory at Mount Badon, where, allegedly, 960 Saxons were killed in a single day by Arthur's personal combat prowess. Now, the historical Arthur, if he existed at all, was nothing like the medieval king of Camelot that later romance would create. He was likely a Romano-British war leader, possibly a cavalry commander who understood Roman military tactics, perhaps bearing a Roman title like Dux Bellorum, Duke of Battles, fighting desperately to preserve what remained of Roman civilization against the Germanic flood. The evidence for Arthur's existence is frustratingly thin. Gildas, writing closest to the supposed time, mentions the Battle of Mount Badon around 500 AD but doesn't name the British commander. The Welsh Annals, compiled centuries later, give 2 entries for Arthur: his victory at Badon in 516 and his death at the Battle of Camlan in 537. Archaeological evidence has found no trace of him despite desperate searching by generations of scholars who want to believe. What we can say with confidence is that something stopped the Saxon advance for about 50 years in the late 5th and early 6th centuries, giving the British kingdoms a final flowering before their ultimate defeat. And whether that something was a single great leader named Arthur, a series of effective war chiefs, or simply Saxon infighting and consolidation matters less than the fact that it happened. The legendary Arthur serves a crucial historical function. He represents the last gasp of Roman Britain, the final attempt to preserve Latin Christianity, urban culture, and Mediterranean civilization against the pagan Germanic tribes who would eventually overwhelm it all. In the Western kingdoms, what would become Wales and Cornwall, Arthur became a symbol of resistance, a once and future king who would return when his people needed him most. And that myth tells us something profound about how traumatic the Saxon conquest was for the British population who survived it. While the British and Saxons were locked in their death struggle for control of lowland Britain, the North was being reshaped by entirely different forces that would create kingdoms most people today have never heard of: Gottadin, Reged, Elmet, and the Kingdom of the Rock, realms that dominated the landscape for centuries before vanishing so completely that we know them only through fragments of poetry and archaeological shadows. The Kingdom of Gottadin controlled the area around modern Edinburgh, ruled by a dynasty that claimed descent from Roman officials and maintained a thoroughly Roman Christian culture even as the world around them turned barbarian. We know about Gottadin primarily through a single epic poem, Why Gododin, composed by the bard Aneurin around 600 AD, and preserved in a 13th century manuscript that may be the oldest surviving Welsh poetry. The poem commemorates a catastrophic military expedition where the warriors of Gododin, 300 elite cavalry, feasted for a year in the great hall of their king, then rode south to attack the Angle stronghold of Catrith, modern Catterick, in a desperate attempt to stop Germanic expansion northward. The poem is a litany of glorious deaths, describing each warrior's bravery, his skill in battle, his generosity with gold, and ultimately his slaughter. Apparently only 3 men survived the battle, including the poet himself who lived to tell the tale of this magnificent failure. What makes Y Gododin so valuable historically is its window into the warrior culture of the British kingdoms. These men fought from horseback, wore mail armor, drank imported wine, gave gifts of gold and amber, composed poetry, and died maintaining Roman military tactics against an enemy that would ultimately overwhelm them through sheer numbers and ruthless efficiency. The kingdom of Gododin itself was destroyed sometime in the early 7th century when the Angles of Northumbria expanded northward, and its survivors fled west to Wales carrying their poems and their memories of a realm that had tried to be Rome long after Rome had abandoned them. Even more mysterious and romantic was the kingdom of Reged, which controlled much of modern Cumbria and possibly southern Scotland, ruled by a dynasty that produced Urien, possibly the most successful British war leader of the late 6th century who wasn't mythologized into Arthur. Urien of Reged was praised by the bard Taliesin in poems that still survive, celebrating his victories against the Angles and his defense of British territory with a ferocity and skill that made him a terror to his enemies. The poems describe Urien as generous to his warriors, terrible in battle, a man who harried the Angles in every region, who besieged them in their fortress on Lindisfarne Island until they were desperate and starving, who came so close to driving the Germanic invaders back into the sea from which they had come. But Urien's success made him dangerous to his fellow British kings who feared his power more than they feared the Saxons. He was assassinated around 590 AD, murdered not by Angles but by a jealous British rival named Morgant, and with his death the last real chance for British victory over the Saxons died too. The tragedy of Urien is the tragedy of the British kingdoms in microcosm. They could never unite, never subordinate their petty rivalries and ancient feuds to the common cause of survival, and so they were defeated piecemeal by enemies who understood that unity was the price of conquest. Reged itself faded from history in the early 7th century, possibly absorbed peacefully through marriage into the expanding Northumbrian kingdom, possibly conquered and destroyed. The sources don't tell us. It simply vanishes from the record like so many of these lost kingdoms, leaving behind only poetry and place names to hint at its former glory. The Saxon kingdoms that were emerging to replace the British realms were themselves locked in brutal competition, creating a patchwork of Germanic states that would spend 2 centuries fighting each other before anything resembling England emerged from the bloodshed. The traditional history speaks of the Heptarchy, 7 kingdoms including Kent, Sussex, Essex, East Anglia, Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria. Though this neat division obscures a far messier reality of dozens of petty kingdoms, sub-kingdoms, and tribal territories that shifted constantly through war, marriage, and assassination. Kent was the first to become powerful, led by King Ethelbert, who married a Frankish Christian princess named Bertha and allowed the missionary Augustine to establish his base at Canterbury in 597 AD, beginning the conversion of the pagan Saxons to Christianity that would fundamentally reshape British culture. Northumbria, formed from the union of 2 earlier kingdoms, Bernicia and Dara, expanded aggressively in the early 7th century under kings like Athelfrith, the Twister, who earned his nickname through treachery and earned his kingdom through relentless warfare that pushed British territory back to the Western Mountains. The Battle of Chester around 616 AD saw Athelfrith massacre a British army and, according to Bede's later account, deliberately slaughter over 1,000 unarmed monks who had come to pray for British victory. An atrocity that demonstrated the religious and ethnic dimensions of these wars, where Christian Britons faced pagan Saxons who saw both their land and their faith as targets for destruction. Athelfrith himself was killed by the King of East Anglia in 616, and his sons fled into exile among the British and Scots, learning the very culture their father had tried to destroy, a irony that would shape the next generation of Northumbrian politics when these exiled princes returned to claim their inheritance. The most significant of these returning princes was Oswald, who had spent years in exile on the Scottish island of Iona, where Irish missionaries had established a monastery that would become the spiritual heart of northern Christianity. Oswald returned to Northumbria in 634 AD with a small army and a massive wooden cross that he erected on the eve of battle at Heavenfield, where he faced the British King Cedwallon of Gwynedd, who had been ravaging Northumbria in alliance with the previous Northumbrian King Penda of Mercia in a temporary British-Saxon alliance against common enemies. Oswald's victory at Heavenfield, attributed to miraculous Christian intervention by later sources, made him King of Northumbria, and he immediately invited Irish monks from Iona to establish a monastery at Lindisfarne that would become the center of a golden age of Northumbrian Christianity, art, and learning. This is where the story gets fascinatingly complex, because Christianity was coming to Britain from two different directions. From the south through Canterbury with Roman traditions and allegiance to the Pope, and from the north through Iona with Celtic traditions developed in Ireland and Scotland that differed on crucial matters like how to calculate Easter and how monks should wear their tonsures, seemingly trivial differences that represented profound questions about authority, identity, and whether British Christianity would be Roman or something uniquely its own. Oswald's reign brought Northumbria to the peak of its power, with overlordship acknowledged by multiple southern kingdoms, but it was cut short in 642 AD when he died in battle against Penda of Mercia at Maserfield. His body dismembered and displayed on stakes in a pagan victory ritual that shocked Christian chroniclers and made Oswald a martyr whose relics would be venerated for centuries. His brother Oswiu succeeded him and eventually defeated and killed Penda in 655 AD at the Battle of Winwade, where according to sources Penda's pagan army drowned in a flooding river that Christians attributed to divine intervention. With Penda's death, the last great pagan Anglo-Saxon kingdom converted to Christianity, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. The religious question that Oswald had brought to a head, Roman Christianity versus Celtic Christianity, came to a crisis at the Synod of Whitby in 664 AD, one of the most consequential church councils in British history that most people have never heard of. King Oswiu of Northumbria found himself in an absurd situation. He followed the Celtic tradition learned from Irish monks and celebrated Easter on different dates than his wife Eanfled, who followed the Roman tradition, meaning that the king was celebrating the resurrection while the queen was still fasting for Lent, a marital and political problem that highlighted the deeper division within English Christianity. Oswiu called a council at the double monastery of Whitby, ruled by the formidable Abbess Hilda, where advocates for both traditions presented their cases before the king, who would decide which Christianity England would follow. The Celtic side was represented by Colman, Bishop of Lindisfarne, who argued for the traditions of St. Columba and the Irish Church that had preserved Christianity through centuries when Rome was collapsing. The Roman side was represented by Wilfrid, an ambitious young cleric who argued that the universal church centered on Rome and St. Peter held the keys to heaven itself. According to Bede's account, Oswiu asked Colman whether St. Peter really held the keys to heaven, and when Colman admitted this was true, Oswiu declared that he would not contradict Peter lest he be denied entry to heaven. And with that somewhat flippant logic, English Christianity became Roman rather than Celtic. Lindisfarne's Irish monks packed up and left in protest, and Britain's last significant connection to its Celtic Christian past was severed. The decision at Whitby meant that England would look south to Rome rather than west to Ireland for its spiritual authority, would adopt continental European practices and culture, and would increasingly see itself as distinct from and superior to the Celtic kingdoms of Wales, Scotland, and Ireland that had preserved Christianity when the English were still pagan savages, an irony not lost on bitter Celtic observers. The late 7th and 8th centuries saw the emergence of Mercia as the dominant Saxon kingdom under a succession of powerful kings who built something resembling an English state long before England officially existed. King Penda had established Mercia as a military power, but it was Wulfhere, Athelred, and especially Offa who transformed it into the most sophisticated kingdom in Britain, with an administrative system, a currency, diplomatic relations with continental powers, and the ability to undertake massive engineering projects that showcased royal power. Offa, who ruled from 757 to 796 AD, was probably the most powerful English king before Alfred the Great, controlling directly or indirectly everything from the English Channel to the Scottish border, corresponding as an equal with Charlemagne, who controlled most of continental Europe, and reorganizing the English Church through councils and new bishoprics that increased royal control over ecclesiastical affairs. Offa's most visible legacy is the immense earthwork known as Offa's Dyke, a ditch and rampart system that runs for about 150 miles along the Welsh border, marking the frontier between English Mercia and the Welsh kingdoms with a monument that required thousands of workers laboring for years to complete. It wasn't a defensive wall like Hadrian's Wall, but rather a boundary marker, a statement of territorial claim, and a demonstration of the king's ability to marshal resources on an unprecedented scale. The dike also tells us that by the late 8th century, the frontier between English and Welsh territory had largely stabilized, with the British pushed back to the Western Mountains and the lowlands firmly under Saxon control. The age of conquest was ending, replaced by an age of consolidation and state building. Offa styled himself King of the English on his coinage and in his charters, a title that was premature but prophetic, suggesting a vision of unified English kingship that wouldn't be fully realized for another century but was beginning to emerge from the chaos of the Dark Ages. He married his daughters to kings and princes across Britain and the continent, arranged the succession carefully to his son Edgefrith, and seemed to have built a dynasty that would dominate Britain for generations. But Edgefrith died just months after Offa in 796 AD, and Mercian power began a slow decline that would see it eventually subordinated to Wessex, teaching the lesson that in the Dark Ages, everything depended on the strength of individual kings and could collapse with shocking speed. When those kings died, while the English kingdoms were consolidating in the south and east, the north of Britain was being transformed by the rise of the Picts and the Scots into the kingdom that would eventually become Scotland, though this process was even more violent and chaotic than the English story. The Picts remain one of the most mysterious peoples in British history. We have their elaborate symbol stones covered in enigmatic carvings. We have references to them in Roman and Irish sources. We have king lists of their rulers, but we've lost their language, their literature, and most of their history because they were ultimately absorbed by the Scots and their story was told by their conquerors. What we know is that the Picts controlled most of what is now Scotland north of the Fourth Clyde Line, organized into kingdoms that competed for power with a high king who claimed supremacy over the others, practicing a unique form of matrilineal succession where kingship passed through the female line, a system that baffled and fascinated Mediterranean observers who saw it as exotic and barbaric. The Pictish kings were powerful enough to defeat Roman legions, to maintain independence throughout the Roman period, and to create a sophisticated culture that produced remarkable metalwork, intricate stone carvings, and what must have been a rich oral literature that has been lost to us forever. The Scots, remember, at this time meaning the Irish who were settling in western Britain, had established the kingdom of Dalriada spanning the narrow sea between Ireland and Britain, controlling parts of both islands and bringing Gaelic language and culture to what would become Scotland. The crucial moment came in 843 AD when Kenneth MacAlpin, a king with both Scottish and Pictish royal blood, unified the Picts and Scots into a single kingdom that would be called Scotland, though whether this was a peaceful merger, a conquest, or something in between remains hotly debated by historians who note the suspicious way that Pictish culture, language, and identity disappeared remarkably quickly after this union, suggesting perhaps something darker than the traditional narrative of peaceful unification. The Welsh kingdoms, the direct descendants of the Romano-British realms that had once controlled all of Britain, were developing their own distinctive identity in the Western Mountains, transforming from failed defenders of Roman civilization into something new and uniquely Welsh. By the 9th century, Wales was divided into several major kingdoms: Gwynedd in the north, Powys in the center, Deheubarth in the south, each ruled by dynasties that claimed descent from Roman officials or legendary British heroes, each maintaining a sophisticated poetic and legal culture that preserved memories of the lost age before the Saxons came. The Welsh kings had learned to survive through a combination of diplomacy, alliance building, strategic marriage, and when necessary, fierce defensive warfare in mountain terrain that gave them advantages over lowland enemies. They had also developed a unique identity that was consciously British. They called themselves Cymry, fellow countrymen, and their land Cymru, defining themselves as the true Britons who had maintained their language, their laws, and their independence while the eastern lowlands had been conquered by Germanic barbarians. The great Welsh kingdoms produced remarkable rulers like Rhodri the Great, who united much of Wales in the 9th century and fought successfully against both Vikings and English, and Hywel the Good, who in the 10th century codified Welsh law into a sophisticated legal system that would govern Wales for centuries and demonstrated the cultural achievements of kingdoms that English sources often dismissed as barbaric peripheries. The Welsh were also becoming the guardians of British mythology and literature. They preserved the poems about Arthur, about Urien and Taliesin, about the lost kingdoms of the north, weaving these memories into a rich literary tradition that would eventually inspire medieval romance across Europe. In this sense, Wales became the keeper of the Dark Ages memory, the place where the British story survived even as it was being erased everywhere else. But just as the various kingdoms of Britain were settling into a kind of equilibrium, just as stable boundaries and political systems were emerging from the chaos, a new threat appeared that would devastate all of them equally and force the creation of something new. The Vikings were coming, and nothing would ever be the same again. The first recorded Viking raid hit the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793 AD, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles entry captures the shock. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The Church of St. Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments. The Vikings, primarily Danes and Norwegians seeking wealth, land, and adventure, saw the rich monasteries of Britain as undefended treasure houses waiting to be plucked, and for the next several decades they launched annual raids that grew progressively bolder and more destructive. The early raids were hit-and-run affairs, arrive in fast ships, attack before defenders could organize, grab everything valuable, kill anyone who resisted, and sail away before royal armies could respond. But by the 850s and 860s, the raids were transforming into something far more dangerous: conquest and settlement. The Great Heathen Army, as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called it, arrived in 865 AD with thousands of warriors intent not on raiding but on conquering English kingdoms and settling permanently on seized land. Within a decade, this Viking army had destroyed the kingdoms of Northumbria and East Anglia, had conquered most of Mercia, and was threatening Wessex, the last independent English kingdom, with extinction. The Saxon kingdoms that had taken 4 centuries to build were collapsing in less than 10 years before the Viking onslaught. This is where Alfred emerges, the only English king ever called the Great, the man who saved Wessex and with it the very idea of England from total destruction. Alfred became King of Wessex in 871 AD at possibly the worst moment in his kingdom's history. He fought 9 battles against the Vikings in his first year as king, won some and lost more, and was forced to buy peace with tribute payments that emptied his treasury and bought only temporary respite. By 878 AD, Alfred's situation was desperate. A surprise Viking attack in midwinter had forced him to flee into the Somerset marshes with a tiny warband, hiding on the island of Athelney while his kingdom collapsed around him and most people assumed the line of Wessex kings had ended. This is the moment of the famous legend of Alfred burning the cakes, sheltering in a peasant woman's hut, supposedly so distracted by his desperate planning that he let the cakes burn and got scolded by a woman who didn't recognize her king. A story that's probably fictional but captures something true about how completely Alfred's fortunes had fallen. But Alfred didn't surrender or flee overseas like other defeated English kings had done. Instead, he used his marshland refuge to gather supporters, to build a new army from the scattered remnants of his kingdom's fighting men. And when spring came, he emerged from the marshes and called his people to one last desperate battle. The Battle of Edington in 878 AD was the hinge on which English history turned. Alfred's army met the Vikings under their leader Guthrum and fought for an entire day until the Vikings broke and fled to their fortress, which Alfred then besieged until starvation forced them to surrender. The peace treaty that followed, formalized in the Treaty of Wedmore, was remarkably creative. Alfred forced Guthrum to accept Christian baptism, with Alfred standing as his godfather, creating a kinship bond that helped enforce the peace. Established a boundary line dividing England between Wessex and the Viking-controlled Danelaw, and most importantly, one time and breathing space to rebuild his shattered kingdom into something that could resist future Viking attacks. What Alfred did with that breathing space transformed Wessex and laid the foundations for the Kingdom of England that his descendants would create. He built a network of fortified towns called Buzz, strategically located so that no one in Wessex was more than 20 miles from a refuge, garrisoned by local defenders who were given land in exchange for military service. This system turned Wessex into a militarized society capable of rapid mobilization against Viking raids. He reorganized the army so that half the fighting men were always on duty while the other half worked their farms, solving the problem that had plagued earlier English kingdoms where harvest time meant armies dissolved as soldiers went home to gather crops. He built a navy, recognizing that you couldn't effectively fight seaborne raiders from land alone, though his ships were initially less successful than his land reforms. But Alfred's genius wasn't just military. He launched a cultural revival that brought learning, literacy, and Latin scholarship back to a kingdom where, by Alfred's own account, hardly anyone south of the Thames could read Latin anymore, where monasteries had been destroyed, where books had been burned, and where intellectual life had collapsed. Alfred personally translated Latin texts into English, commissioned the creation of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle to record English history, invited scholars from Wales and the continent to his court, and established schools to educate the sons of nobles in both English and Latin literacy. Why did a warrior king fighting for survival care so much about books and learning? Alfred articulated a vision that linked military success with cultural renewal, arguing that the Viking invasions were God's punishment for English neglect of learning and religion, and that only by restoring Christian culture could England hope for divine favor and ultimate victory. He was building not just a kingdom but a Christian English civilization that could claim moral superiority over the pagan Vikings even while fighting them to a standstill. Alfred died in 899 AD, and the kingdom he left to his son Edward the Elder was unrecognizably different from the desperate remnant he had inherited 28 years earlier. Wessex was now the most powerful, best organized, most militarily effective state in Britain, poised for expansion. Edward and his remarkable sister Ethelflaed, who ruled Mercia as Lady of the Mercians after her husband's death, launched a coordinated campaign to conquer the Viking-held Danelaw, building Buzz, winning battles, accepting submissions from English populations who welcomed West Saxon rule over Viking domination. Ethelflaed deserves far more recognition than she typically gets. She was one of the most effective military leaders of the age, male or female, founding towns, leading armies, negotiating treaties, and gradually pushing Viking territory northward until her death in 918 AD. By the time Edward died in 924 AD, his son Athelstan inherited a realm that controlled most of England south of the Humber, with even the Viking kings of York acknowledging some form of West Saxon overlordship. The dream of a unified England was becoming reality through systematic conquest disguised as liberation of fellow English Christians from pagan Viking rule. Athelstan, who ruled from 924 to 939 AD, was the first king who could legitimately claim to be king of the English, ruling a unified kingdom rather than just a powerful king claiming overlordship. He conquered York from the Vikings, received submissions from the Welsh kings, forced the king of the Scots to acknowledge his authority, and even married his sisters to continental rulers, positioning himself as a major European power rather than just a provincial island king. The climax of Ethelstan's reign came in 937 AD at the Battle of Brunanburh, one of the bloodiest battles in Dark Ages Britain and a defining moment in the creation of English identity. A massive coalition had formed against Athelstan, bringing together Vikings from Dublin, the King of Scotland, the King of Strathclyde, and perhaps some northern English rebels, all united in their determination to break West Saxon power and restore the old fragmented Britain where multiple kingdoms competed on roughly equal terms. The battle was fought somewhere in northern England. The exact location remains unknown despite centuries of searching, which tells you how much of this history has been lost. And according to the contemporary poem in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the fighting lasted from dawn until dusk with appalling casualties on both sides. The poem celebrates an English victory, boasting that never before had so many fallen in Britain since the Angles and Saxons arrived, that 5 kings and 7 earls died on the coalition side, that the survivors fled in their ships pursued by West Saxon warriors who slaughtered them on the beaches. Brunanburh secured Ethelstan's claim to be the first king of all England, demonstrating that West Saxon military superiority could defeat even a grand coalition of all its enemies. But the victory was bought at enormous cost in English lives and didn't permanently solve the problem of northern independence. The kings of Scotland would continue to contest control of Northumbria for another century, and the dream of a unified Britain under one ruler remained as elusive as ever. What had been created by the mid-10th century was not yet the medieval England of castles, feudalism, and Norman French that would emerge after 1066, but something distinctly its own, an Anglo-Saxon kingdom that blended Germanic, British, and Scandinavian elements into a unique culture. The English language was developing its distinctive character, absorbing thousands of Old Norse words from the Danelaw settlements while maintaining its Germanic grammatical core, creating a linguistic flexibility that would eventually make English one of the world's most adaptable languages. The English Church was producing remarkable scholarship and art, the Lindisfarne Gospels, the Vercelli Book, the Exeter Book full of poetry, and sophisticated Latin texts that demonstrated that English monasteries were participating fully in European intellectual culture. English kings had developed administrative systems including shire organization, reeves to collect taxes and administer justice, written law codes that applied across the kingdom, and a coinage system that was remarkably sophisticated for its time. The social structure was complex, ranging from slaves at the bottom through various grades of free peasants and landholders to thanes, noble warriors who held land in exchange for military service, to earls who governed regions on the king's behalf, all bound together by oaths of loyalty and reciprocal obligations that created a web of relationships far more complex than simple feudalism. But this England was also fragile, still threatened by Vikings who had merely paused their invasions, still contested by Celtic kingdoms that remembered when they had controlled these lands, still dependent on the strength of individual kings in an age when violence, disease, or accident could kill a king and plunge the kingdom into succession crisis. The fragility became apparent in the late 10th and early 11th centuries when a new wave of Viking attacks, this time led by the Danish crown rather than independent raiders, brought England to the brink of collapse once again. King Athelred II, unfairly nicknamed the Unready, actually meaning ill-counseled, faced the impossible task of defending England against organized Danish invasions while managing internal dissension and treachery that undermined every defensive effort. The infamous St. Brice's Day massacre of 1002 AD, where Athelred ordered the killing of all Danes in England, was a desperate and ultimately disastrous attempt to eliminate a fifth column that he believed was aiding Danish invaders. The massacre failed to kill most Danes but did succeed in enraging the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard, whose sister may have been among the victims, and who launched a campaign of revenge that culminated in Sweyn's conquest of England in 1013 AD and Ethelred's flight into Norman exile. Sweyn died just weeks after his triumph and Athelred briefly returned, but the struggle between English and Danish claims to the throne continued through the reigns of Ethelred's son Edmund Ironside and Sweyn's son Nut, until the compromise that made Nut king of all England in 1016 AD. The English kingdom that Alfred and his descendants had built had fallen continue 14:24 under foreign control, proving that all their military reforms and state building couldn't permanently secure independence. Ironically, Nut's reign from 1016 to 1035 AD was one of the most successful and peaceful in English history, demonstrating that Danish rule wasn't necessarily worse than English rule and that national identity was still fluid enough that a Danish king could become thoroughly English. Knut kept most English laws, customs, and administrative systems intact, promoted both Danish and English nobles to high positions, married Ethelred's widow Emma to legitimize his claim and unite the rival dynasties, supported the English church lavishly, and ruled not as a foreign conqueror but as a Christian English king who happened to also be king of Denmark and later Norway, creating a North Sea empire that made England a major European power. The famous story of Knut and the Waves, where he supposedly commanded the tide to stop to demonstrate the limits of royal power, is probably apocryphal but captures something true about Knut's image as a wise and humble Christian king rather than a pagan Viking tyrant. Knut's reign proved that the Dark Ages categories of British versus Saxon versus Viking were breaking down, that identity was becoming more about political allegiance and religious culture than ethnic origin, and that the various peoples of Britain were capable of creating hybrid societies that blended the best of all traditions. But Knut's empire died with him in 1035 AD, fragmenting among his sons who lacked his political genius, and within 7 years the English crown had returned to the Old English royal line in the person of Edward the Confessor, Ethelred's son who had spent 25 years in Norman exile and brought Norman cultural influences and Norman advisors with him when he returned, setting up the tensions that would eventually explode in 1066 and bring the Dark Ages definitively to an end. The transformation of Britain from the end of Roman rule to the eve of the Norman conquest is a story of resilience, adaptation, and survival against overwhelming odds. The Romano-British population that watched the legions sail away in 410 AD couldn't have imagined that their language, culture, and political structures would be pushed to the western fringes of the island by Germanic invaders. But they also couldn't have imagined that those invaders would convert to Christianity, adopt Latin literacy, build a sophisticated kingdom, and eventually create an English identity that would spread across the world. The lost kingdoms, Gottingen, Reged, Elmet, and dozens of others whose names we don't even know, weren't failures but way stations, experiments in post-Roman government that tried different approaches to the problem of survival and taught their successors valuable lessons through their success and failures. The British kingdoms of Wales, Scotland, and eventually Ireland preserved traditions, languages, and cultural practices that might otherwise have been lost entirely, creating a Celtic cultural sphere that would influence European Christianity, literature, and art even as it lost political control of Britain. The English kingdoms that emerged from the Saxon migrations weren't simple barbarian states but sophisticated polities that developed effective military systems, centralized governments, rich literary cultures, and eventually a unified kingdom that could stand as an equal to continental powers. The Vikings, who seemed like destroyers of civilization, were also settlers who brought new technologies, new trade connections, new words and customs that enriched English culture even as they challenged English power. The Danelaw territories became some of the most prosperous and urbanized regions of medieval England, and the Scandinavian influences on English language, law, and culture were profound and permanent. What we call the Dark Ages weren't dark because of any lack of culture or civilization, but because so much of the written record was lost. The British kingdoms didn't write their histories, the early English kingdoms produced limited documentation, the Vikings emphasized oral culture over written texts, and later medieval writers either didn't know or didn't care about preserving the details of these turbulent centuries. What survives are fragments. A poem here, a king list there, archaeological evidence that has to be interpreted carefully, later sources that contain kernels of truth wrapped in layers of legend and propaganda, and place names that hint at vanished political realities. Modern historians and archaeologists have worked miracles recovering this lost history through careful analysis of what little evidence remains. But we're always aware of how much we don't know. How many questions can never be answered? How many kingdoms rose and fell without leaving enough evidence for us to even know their names? The people who lived through these centuries experienced them not as dark, but as the only reality they knew. They fell in love, raised children, told stories, made beautiful objects, fought for causes they believed in, built kingdoms that they hoped would last forever, and faced catastrophe and opportunity with the same human courage and failure that characterizes every age. They weren't primitive or simple-minded. They were solving complex political, military, economic, and cultural problems with the tools available to them, and many of their solutions were remarkably effective given the constraints they faced. The legacy of Britain's Dark Ages is all around us if we know where to look. In the county boundaries that often preserve ancient kingdom borders, in the English language itself with its multiple linguistic layers telling stories of conquest and assimilation, in the Welsh and Gaelic languages that maintain unbroken links to the pre-Saxon past, in the Christian church organization that the Saxons created and that lasted until the Reformation, in the legal traditions and governmental structures that have evolved but never completely broken with their Anglo-Saxon origins. The image of King Arthur, whether he existed or not, continues to inspire because he represents the hope of resistance against overwhelming odds, the dream of a golden age that might return, the ideal of a just king who protects his people. Themes that resonate across centuries and cultures. The monastery at Lindisfarne, destroyed by Vikings in 793 AD, rebuilt, and ultimately abandoned, became a romantic ruin that inspired poets and artists to meditate on the transience of power and the endurance of faith. The great dikes and earthworks that kings like Offa built to mark their territories still scar the landscape, reminding us that people were willing to move millions of tons of earth to make political statements that would outlast their own lives. The Anglo-Saxon churches that dot the English countryside, with their distinctive long and short coining and tiny windows, are survivors from this age, still used for worship over 1,000 years after they were built by communities that faced existential threats but still invested in creating something beautiful and permanent. Understanding the Dark Ages helps us understand how Britain became what it is. A collection of nations with distinct identities bound together by geography, history, and complicated relationships that involve both cooperation and conflict. The English dominance of Britain wasn't inevitable. It was the result of specific political and military developments in the 5th through 11th centuries that could have gone differently at multiple points. If the British had united under a single leader in the 6th century, if the Saxons had been defeated at a crucial battle, if the Vikings had completely conquered England, if the Scots had expanded southward instead of being contained, any of these alternative outcomes could have created a very different Britain. The Welsh identity as the true Britons who maintained their independence and culture despite English pressure, the Scottish identity forged from the union of Picts and Scots in opposition to English expansion, the complex Irish relationship with Britain involving both conflict and cultural exchange. All these were shaped by the patterns established in the Dark Ages. The English language's unusual flexibility and willingness to absorb foreign words, which helped make it a global language, was partly the result of the linguistic mixing that occurred when British, Saxon, Viking, and French speakers all had to communicate in the same island. The British political tradition of strong central government balanced by local administration, of written law codes and established procedures, has roots in Anglo-Saxon political culture that was surprisingly sophisticated for its time. The story of Britain's lost kingdoms is ultimately a story about how civilizations respond to catastrophic change, some by clinging to the past like the Romano-British trying to preserve Roman culture after Rome abandoned them, some by adapting and innovating like the Saxons creating new kingdoms from scratch, some by retreating to defensible positions and maintaining their identity against pressure like the Welsh and Scots, and some by migrating and starting over like the British who fled to Brittany and the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes who came to Britain seeking new opportunities. None of these strategies guaranteed success. Kingdoms rose and fell based on the competence of individual leaders, the fortune of battles, the productivity of harvests, the severity of plagues, and countless other factors beyond anyone's control. What made the difference between kingdoms that survived and those that vanished was often resilience. The ability to lose battles without losing wars, to adapt traditions without abandoning identity, to compromise when necessary without surrendering everything, to learn from enemies even while fighting them. The Wessex dynasty that united England succeeded partly because Alfred and his descendants were willing to borrow shamelessly from everyone. Using Viking ship designs, adopting Mercian administrative techniques, learning from Frankish political models, taking inspiration from classical Roman texts, while maintaining a core English Christian identity that gave their kingdom cohesion and purpose. As we reach the mid-11th century and the end of our story, Britain was unrecognizably different from the Roman province that had fragmented in the early 5th century. The population spoke different languages. English had become dominant in the lowlands, replacing British completely in most areas except personal and place names that preserved ghostly memories of earlier inhabitants. Christianity had transformed from a minority Roman cult to the universal religion that defined civilization itself, with Britain producing saints, scholars, and missionaries who influenced continental Europe as much as they were influenced by it. The political map had consolidated from dozens of petty kingdoms into a handful of major realms. The Kingdom of England covering most of the islands south of Scotland, the Kingdom of Scotland increasingly unified under a single dynasty, the Welsh kingdoms maintaining independence but increasingly pressured by English expansion, and the complex situation in Ireland where Viking settlements, Irish kingdoms, and emerging Norse-Irish hybrid cultures created a patchwork that defied simple categorization. The economy had transformed from the monetized, trade-oriented Roman system to a more localized, agricultural economy, and was now slowly monetizing again with the growth of towns, markets, and international trade that connected Britain to Scandinavia, the continent, and even the Mediterranean. The military culture had evolved from Roman professional legions to Germanic warrior warbands to the sophisticated FYRD system of English kingdoms that could mobilize thousands of soldiers when needed, with nascent ideas about cavalry, fortification, and naval power that would develop further in coming centuries. The Dark Ages ended not with a sudden transformation but with a gradual realization that the post-Roman world was becoming the medieval world, that new structures had emerged to replace what Rome had left behind, that Britain was no longer looking backward to a lost golden age but forward to new possibilities. The Norman conquest of 1066 is traditionally marked as the end of the Anglo-Saxon period and the Dark Ages. But this is somewhat arbitrary. The Normans conquered England but not Wales or Scotland. They brought new languages and customs but didn't erase English culture. They imported continental feudalism but built on Anglo-Saxon administrative foundations. They transformed but didn't completely replace what they found. The continuities across 1066 are as important as the changes. The shire system continued, English common law developed from Anglo-Saxon legal traditions. The English Church maintained its organization and many of its customs. And beneath the Norman aristocracy, the English population continued speaking English, farming their land, and maintaining cultural traditions that stretched back through the Dark Ages to the Romano-British period and beyond. What the Normans ended was the political independence of the Anglo-Saxon ruling class and the possibility that England would remain primarily connected to Scandinavia rather than continental Europe. They pulled England decisively into the orbit of French culture and Mediterranean Christianity. But they couldn't erase the centuries of cultural development that had created a distinctly English identity. The lost kingdoms of the Dark Ages, British, Saxon, and Viking, left legacies that transcended their political destruction. The Kingdom of Gododin left us Y Gododin, one of the oldest surviving Welsh poems, a meditation on heroic failure that influenced British literature for centuries. The Kingdom of Reged left the poems of Taliesin, celebrating a king who almost succeeded in pushing back the Saxon tide. The Kingdom of Northumbria left the Lindisfarne Gospels, the Ruthwell Cross, Bede's ecclesiastical history, and a cultural flowering that made northern England the intellectual center of Europe in the 8th century. The Kingdom of Mercia left Offa's Dyke, a permanent mark on the landscape and a reminder that medieval states could undertake massive public works projects. The Kingdom of Wessex left the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a historical record that preserved the English perspective on these turbulent centuries, and the political structure that became the Kingdom of England. Each lost kingdom was an experiment in how to organize society, how to balance local autonomy with central authority, how to maintain cultural identity while adapting to changing circumstances, and how to create meaning and purpose in an uncertain world. And each experiment, whether it succeeded or failed politically, contributed to the cultural heritage that British nations inherited. The people of the Dark Ages understood something that modern people often forget: that civilization is always fragile, always one generation from collapse if not actively maintained, always dependent on the courage and wisdom of individuals who make choices with incomplete information and uncertain outcomes. The Romano-British, watching the legions leave, could have simply surrendered to despair, accepting that civilization was over and barbarism inevitable. Some did, retreating into isolated communities and trying to preserve what they could. But others fought back, invited mercenaries, made alliances, built new kingdoms, and tried to preserve what they valued about Roman culture, even as they adapted to new realities. The Saxons arriving in Britain could have remained mere raiders and pirates, taking what they wanted and moving on. Instead, they built permanent settlements, converted to Christianity, embraced literacy and learning, and created a culture that blended their Germanic heritage with British and Roman influences into something new. The Vikings arriving in the 9th century could have simply destroyed everything they found. Instead, many settled, intermarried, converted, and became as English as the Saxons they initially fought against, demonstrating that identity is more about choices and culture than about ethnic purity. The kings and queens, warriors and priests, poets and farmers who lived through these centuries didn't know they were living in the Dark Ages. They were simply trying to survive, to protect their families, to serve their gods, to build something lasting, and to leave a legacy for their children that would justify the struggles they endured. Standing here at the end of our journey through Britain's lost kingdoms, we can see that what was lost was political independence and territorial control, but what endured was cultural identity, linguistic heritage, religious tradition, and collective memory. The Welsh kept their language and their stories. The Scots forged a kingdom that would maintain independence for another 7 centuries. The English created a nation that would eventually spread its language and culture across the globe. And all the peoples of Britain carried forward traditions and values shaped by the Dark Ages experience of loss, adaptation, and survival. The ruins of Roman cities where people sheltered during the chaos, the hill forts reoccupied after centuries of abandonment, the monasteries established in wilderness to preserve learning, the kingdoms founded by ambitious warlords and sustained by communal effort, the poems composed to celebrate heroes and mourn defeats, the laws written to create order from chaos, the churches built to assert faith in a violent world. All these are testaments to the human capacity to respond to catastrophe with creativity, courage, and hope. The Dark Ages were dark not because civilization disappeared, but because the light of Roman certainty was replaced by the uncertain flickering of multiple flames, each kingdom and culture lighting its own path through the darkness, sometimes cooperating and sometimes fighting, but all ultimately contributing to the complex tapestry of British identity that emerged from these centuries of transformation. This is the story of Britain's lost kingdoms. Not a tale of simple decline and fall, but a complicated narrative of death and rebirth, of traditions preserved and innovations embraced, of peoples who lost their kingdoms but kept their souls, and of the Dark Ages that weren't dark at all but were instead a time of remarkable creativity, resilience, and human achievement against impossible odds, a time that shaped Britain and through Britain shaped the world in ways that echo down to our present.